3 spoons. That's all it took to end a man's certainty that no one could ever touch what belonged to him. Jasmine Brooks didn't know the name Alexander Kim when she scraped the last of a stranger's short rib off a takeout container she never ordered. She only knew she was starving, humiliated, and one bad date away from swearing off men entirely. She posted the confession before she thought better of it, a joke, a caption, a tag she pulled straight off the delivery slip without a second glance. By morning, it wasn't a joke anymore. It was trending, and somewhere across the city, in an office built to make grown men flinch, a phone lit up with her name on it. Alexander Kim didn't smile often. His people knew better than to expect it. But when his second-in-command slid a phone across the desk and said someone had eaten his dinner and posted his real name to 40,000 strangers, something in his jaw shifted, not fury. Interest. In a life built on precision, where every variable was accounted for before it moved, a woman he'd never met had just become the first unplanned thing to happen to him in a decade. He told his enforcers to stand down. He would handle this one personally. Jasmine Brooks built Brooks & Bone out of stubbornness and thread, a small atelier with 2 employees, a waiting list of dreams bigger than her bank account, and a habit of reading people so accurately it unnerved them. She'd catch the flinch behind a smile before the person catching it even knew they were performing. It was the gift that got her through every disappointing date, every man who mistook her calm for an invitation to underestimate her. It would also be the thing that eventually saw straight through the most dangerous man in the city. He showed up at her studio holding a cake he hadn't ordered from anywhere ordinary, dressed like old money and moving like something far more careful than that. She expected an apology demand. Instead, she got a man who looked at her like he'd been recalculating his entire life in the 30 seconds since she opened the door. She didn't know, not yet, that the calm in his voice was a decade of discipline. That the empire behind his company's letterhead ran on decisions far bloodier than boardroom votes. All she knew was that when he asked for her number instead of an apology, she gave it to him and told herself it meant nothing. It would turn out to mean everything. Because Alexander Kim didn't chase women, didn't trust easily, and had never once let himself fall. Until a stranger ate his dinner, told the internet his name, and looked at him like she already knew exactly what he was hiding. She just didn't know how much. The knock came 20 minutes after Jasmine had given up on dinner altogether. She'd already resigned herself to a sleeve of crackers and the lingering sting of a date that had somehow managed to be both boring and infuriating, a man who'd spent 2 hours explaining, unprompted, why loyalty was an outdated evolutionary glitch. She hadn't asked. She hadn't wanted to know. She'd wanted her short rib and a night where nobody explained anything to her. So when the delivery bag landed in her hands smelling like butter and truffle and something that cost more than her rent, she didn't ask questions. She just called Sandra. "This isn't ours," Sandra said, already reaching for a fork. "I know. Like, this is actually not ours." "I know, Sandra." Neither of them put the forks down. There was a kind of reverence to it, the way they ate slow at first, like the food might be evidence in a crime they hadn't committed yet, then faster, laughing, Jasmine moaning dramatically over a bite of something with a sauce she couldn't name and didn't need to. It was, without exaggeration, the best thing that had happened to her all week, possibly all month, and it had arrived by mistake, addressed to a stranger. "You have to post this," Sandra said, already holding up her phone. "This is content. This is a whole public service announcement." Jasmine wiped her mouth, grinning despite herself, and typed it out before she could think better of it, something about biology lectures and karma and a stolen dinner that had redeemed an otherwise disastrous night. She found the name on the receipt taped to the bag, typed it in without a second thought, hit post, and went back to eating. She had no way of knowing what that name meant. No way of knowing it belonged to a man who'd built 2 lives stacked on top of each other like a house of cards. Nobody was allowed to see the bottom of one life in glass offices and shareholder meetings, the other in rooms where consequences arrived quietly and permanently. To her, it was just a name on a slip of paper. A punchline. By the time she fell asleep that night, full and laughing and unbothered, the post had already started to move quietly at first, then not quietly at all, toward exactly the kind of attention she'd never meant to invite. Something tells me this isn't the last surprise Alexander Kim has waiting for her. Like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. I'll see you in the next one. The screenshot reached Alexander's desk before his morning coffee cooled. His head of security laid it flat across the glass without a word, the way he delivered anything that mattered: bomb threats, wire transfers, bad news. This time it was a photo of a half-eaten dinner and a caption tagging Alexander Kim by his full legal name, already circling past 40,000 shares. "We can make this disappear," the man said. Quietly. "By tonight, there's no trace it ever existed." Alexander didn't answer right away. He picked up his phone, scrolled through the thread himself, the jokes, the reposts, a woman named Jasmine Brooks laughing at her own audacity in the replies. Completely unaware, she'd just put her name in front of a man capable of erasing people from the world without raising his pulse. He felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to admit. Not threat. Not exposure. Something closer to delight. "No one touches this," he said. His security chief frowned. "Sir, with respect, she used your real name. If this reaches the wrong people, it already reached the right one." Alexander set the phone down, calm settling over him like it always did before he made a decision no one else was allowed to question. "I'll handle her myself. Personally." The room went quiet in the particular way it always did when Alexander Kim decided something wasn't up for discussion. His men had learned not to ask why. They'd also learned that whatever Alexander wanted handled personally usually ended one of two ways, and for the first time in years, even he wasn't certain which one this would be. He picked up his keys instead of his phone. Some conversations, he decided, deserved to happen in person. Alexander walked into Brooks and Bone with nothing in his hands and murder in his posture. No cake this time. No gesture of goodwill. He decided somewhere between the car and the door that charm was a waste on someone who'd carelessly thrown his name to 40,000 strangers. She needed to understand what she'd done. She needed to see, in the space of one conversation, exactly how far above her weight class she'd been playing. He'd handled men twice his size with less preparation than he'd put into this 5-minute visit. The bell above the door announced him, and for a moment the studio swallowed the sound bolts of fabric stacked like sentries, a single lamp throwing gold across a sketch table. Then she looked up. He'd rehearsed the opening line. Something cold. Something that would let her feel, immediately, the weight of what she'd stumbled into. But the words dissolved somewhere between his chest and his mouth, because the woman rising from behind that table was nothing like the blurry profile picture his people had pulled up on a conference room screen. She was radiant in a way photographs couldn't survive. Sharp-eyed, unbothered, already reading him before he'd said a single word, he could see it happening, the quick assessment behind her gaze, the way she clocked his stillness and didn't flinch from it. Men twice his rank flinched from less. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander Kim had absolutely nothing prepared. "Can I help you?" Her voice was steady. Amused, even, like she already suspected he was about to waste her afternoon. He opened his mouth to deliver the line about consequences, about carelessness, about the kind of man she'd tagged without knowing what that meant. What came out instead was, "You look far better in person than in your pictures." Even he heard how absurd it sounded, a man who negotiated silence out of grown adversaries, reduced to compliments in a fashion studio that smelled like starch and fresh coffee. Something flickered across her face. Not fear. Curiosity, maybe, sharpened at the edges. "That's not what I expected you to say." "Neither did I," he admitted, and the honesty cost him more than any threat ever had. The menace he'd walked in with had nowhere left to stand. He watched himself abandon the entire plan in real time, watched himself become, instead, a man asking for her number like it was the only thing that mattered in the room. She gave it to him. Slowly. Like she was deciding something as she did it. "Don't make me regret this," she said. He was already regretting nothing, and that, more than anything, should have terrified him. She almost turned back twice before reaching his door, wine in one hand, a dish still warm in the other, her nerve thinner than she wanted to admit. This wasn't her style, showing up somewhere uninvited with an apology dressed as dinner. But something about the way he looked at her that first night, like he was memorizing her instead of just meeting her, made the drive feel worth the risk. He opened the door before she could knock twice, and for a moment neither of them said anything. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves pushed up, like whatever he'd been doing before she arrived had cost him something. She noticed it immediately, the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw sat just a little too rigid for a man supposedly enjoying an easy evening. "You didn't have to do this," he said, taking the bottle from her hands like it was something fragile. "I wanted to." She stepped past him into a home that felt more like a fortress dressed up as elegance, beautiful, guarded, lonely in a way she recognized instantly. "Consider it payback. You bought a stranger cake. I figured I owed you a real meal." He laughed, but it didn't quite reach his eyes, and she filed that away too. They ate slowly, the conversation drifting from her fabric suppliers to his overseas business trips, and every time the questions veered too close to what he actually did for a living, he redirected with practiced ease. Most people wouldn't have caught it. Jasmine caught everything. "You're carrying something," she said finally, setting her glass down. "I don't know what it is. But it's heavy and you're pretending it isn't." Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe fear, quickly smoothed over. "I'm fine. You keep saying that like it's true." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched her, really watched her, the way a man studies something he's afraid might disappear if he blinks. "No one's ever noticed before," he said quietly. "Not like this." "I notice everything," she said, softer now. "I just don't always say it." For the first time since she'd met him, the composure slipped just an inch, just enough to let her see the man underneath the armor. And in that silence, something between them shifted, quiet and dangerous and entirely too warm. She hadn't asked him to drive her anywhere. That was the thing about Alexander, he simply appeared, black car idling outside her studio at exactly the hour she needed to be 3 places at once, as if he'd already memorized the rhythm of her chaos before she'd told him any of it. "I have deliveries," she'd said that morning, half apology, half warning, expecting him to check his watch and mention a meeting. "Then I have deliveries too," he'd answered, and opened the door like it wasn't the most powerful man in the city, lowering himself into the role of errand boy for an atelier that barely broke even most months. She learned things about him in that car that his reputation never whispered. That he drove with one hand loose on the wheel and the other resting, unconsciously, an inch from hers on the console, never quite touching, always close enough that the air between their fingers felt charged. That he asked questions and actually waited for the answers, watching her face while she talked about hemlines and shipping delays like the words mattered more than anything on his own overloaded schedule. By the 3rd stop, she stopped pretending she wasn't watching him too. "You don't have to keep doing this," she told him outside the fabric warehouse, the afternoon light catching golden eyes that gave away nothing and everything at once. "I know," he said, and didn't move to leave. It was in the small things that she felt herself slipping, the way he remembered she took her coffee black after only being told once, the way his jaw tightened, just barely, when a warehouse manager spoke to her like her time wasn't valuable. She watched him make one quiet phone call after that exchange, voice low and even, and by the following week her shipments started arriving early, her prices somehow better, doors opening that had been closed to her for years. "What did you do?" she asked, half laughing, half suspicious, when a supplier who'd ignored her emails for months personally delivered bolts of hand-dyed cloth to her door. "I made a call," he said, like it was nothing, like he hadn't quietly rearranged a piece of the world just to make hers easier. Then came the morning his team showed up unannounced, sharp, quiet people with laptops and confident hands, building her a storefront online before she'd even finished her coffee. She stood in the doorway of her own studio, watching strangers construct her future in real time, and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with fear. Because this wasn't infatuation anymore. This was a man rearranging his empire, however small the corner, around her. And she still didn't know what he was hiding. She only knew that every time he looked at her steady, unblinking, like she was the only fixed point in a life built on shifting variables, she wanted to stop asking the question. The restaurant had no other guests that night, though Jasmine didn't realize it until she noticed the silence. No clatter of other tables, no hum of strangers' conversation. Just candlelight and the low murmur of a string quartet tucked into a corner, like they'd always been part of the room. Alexander had bought out the entire place. Not reserved it. Bought it for one evening so that nothing and no one could interrupt whatever he was about to say. She should have known something was coming the moment she saw his face. He wasn't wearing the easy charm he usually greeted her with, the boyish confidence that made her forget, sometimes, how careful he was with every word. Tonight his eyes carried weight. He held her chair like it was the last ordinary thing he'd get to do before everything changed. "You look like you're about to tell me something terrible," she said, trying to keep it light, though her pulse had already started to climb. "I'm about to tell you something true," he said. "Which might be worse." She set down her glass. Whatever bravado she'd walked in with quietly excused itself from the table. He talked for a long time before he got to the center of it, about his father, about a company built on two ledgers, one for the world to see and one that told the real story. About the men who answered to him not because they respected him, but because they feared what happened when they didn't. About decisions he'd made in rooms she would never be allowed to imagine, decisions that kept him alive and kept his enemies exactly that, enemies, not corpses, though he didn't pretend the line between those two things was always clean. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't reach for her water, didn't glance away, didn't do any of the small nervous things people do when the ground shifts under them. She just watched him, the way she always watched him, like she was reading something underneath the words. And maybe she was. Maybe she'd known for weeks that the calm in him wasn't peace, it was control, expensive and exhausting, the kind of stillness a man builds when he can't afford to feel anything out loud. "Say something," he said finally, when the silence had gone on long enough to frighten him more than the confession had. "I already knew," she said quietly. "Not the details. Not this. But I knew you were carrying something you weren't letting me see. I just didn't think it would be this heavy." He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath since the night they met. "I need you to understand what you're choosing if you choose to stay. This isn't a version of me you get to negotiate down. It's what's underneath everything else you love." "Then tell me what you want," she said. "Not what you are. What you want." And for the first time since she'd known him, Alexander Kim let his face go completely unguarded. "I want out," he said. "I want a house that isn't wired for threats. I want to fall asleep without running through who might be awake and angry somewhere across the city. I want to marry you, Jasmine. I want mornings that are just mornings. I want a life so quiet it would bore the man I used to be." She reached across the table and took his hand, the one that had signed contracts that ended empires and ended lives, and held it like it was just a hand. "Then build it," she whispered. "Build it with me." He brought her fingers to his lips, slow, like he was trying to memorize the shape of being wanted without conditions. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent to the two people rewriting their entire future over untouched wine. But in that empty restaurant, in that pool of gold light, Alexander Kim believed for the first time in his life that peace might actually be a place he was allowed to live. The morning after their first real date, Jasmine's room still smelled faintly of the candle she'd lit the night before, vanilla and something warmer underneath, low light pooling gold across the walls even now with the curtains barely open. She'd kept his jacket draped over her chair. Hadn't meant to. It had just ended up there, and she hadn't wanted to move it. Alexander showed up with coffee he hadn't needed to bring and a quiet she noticed the second he stepped through her door. He always announced himself with certainty. The room usually rearranged itself around him without trying. Today he stood in the doorway like a man deciding whether to enter a room or a confession. "You're doing the thing," she said, curling up against the pillows, still warm from sleep and last night both. "The thing where you go quiet, and I have to pry it out of you." "I'm not doing a thing. Alexander." He sat at the edge of her bed instead of the chair, close enough that she could feel the weight of whatever he was carrying before he said a word of it. The fairy lights strung along her headboard threw soft gold across his face, made the sharp lines of him look almost gentle, almost safe. Almost. He told her. Not everything. He never told her everything, but enough. The company was a mask. Underneath it was a machine he'd built and bled for, one that had kept them both untouched without her ever knowing what that safety cost. He told her he wanted out. Wanted her a future, a life with none of the shadows folded into it. There's one thing left, he said, taking her hand like it might steady him instead of her. One operation. I close it, I cut every last tie, and there's nothing left that can ever touch us again. I need this, Jasmine. For us. She didn't pull her hand away. She'd spent her whole life reading the space between what people said and what they meant, and she heard it now, clear as the morning light around them. This wasn't the last job. It was never the last job. Men like him didn't walk away clean. They walked toward the next fire because it was the only language they trusted. You're not asking me to build a life with you, she said softly. You're asking me to wait through a war first. It's not like that. Isn't it? She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her like armor she hadn't known she'd need this morning. You want me to imagine a wedding, a future, mornings just like this one, while you're out there risking everything, one more time, for the last time. They always say that. That's not a promise. That's a countdown you're asking me to sit through. I'll come back to you. You don't know that. Nobody in your world gets to know that. Her voice caught, but her eyes held steady on his, the same eyes that had seen straight through him from the very first day. I'm not going to be the woman lying in this bed every night wondering if today is the day you don't come home. I've watched that story before. I won't live inside it. Jasmine. There's no after Alexander. She was standing now, the golden light suddenly feeling less like warmth and more like a spotlight neither of them could hide from. You don't get the empire and the woman who prays you survive it. Walk out that door for this operation, and we're finished. It's the syndicate, or it's me. Choose right now. He looked at her the way a man looks at the one equation his whole empire couldn't solve. His jaw tightened. His hands, steady enough to sign away lives without flinching, curled into the sheets, and he said nothing. Pride and blood and years of obligation held his voice hostage, and his silence answered louder than any words could have. Jasmine waited. 3 seconds. Long enough to be sure. Then she opened her own bedroom door and told him quietly to go. She heard the front door close behind him, heard his footsteps fade down the hall, heard the silence that followed, and somehow it was louder than anything he could have said. Her legs gave out before she reached the bed. She sank onto it, then curled forward, arms wrapped around herself like she could hold the pieces in place by sheer will. The tears came before she could stop them, before pride could catch up to heartbreak. She hadn't meant to fall this hard, this fast. She hadn't meant to memorize the sound of his laugh, or the weight of his hand, or the exact way he said her name like it was something rare. But she had. Somewhere between a stolen dinner and this golden, wrecked morning, she'd fallen completely in love with a man she'd just sent away. She pressed her face into the pillow that still smelled like him and let herself feel every bit of it, the love, the fear, the fury at herself for wanting a man who could walk toward danger before he walked toward her. She'd meant every word she said. She still did. But meaning something and surviving it were two very different things, and right now, alone in a room full of light, she couldn't feel anymore. She wasn't sure which one would break her first. Hit like, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, and let me know in the comments. Does Jasmine hold the line, or does love pull her back in? I'll see you in the next one.